Welcome to the Her Story Circle podcast, the podcast that brings you the extraordinary tales of everyday women who are changing the world. I'm your host, Gertrude Mache, and I'd like to acknowledge traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today. I also like to pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. Every week, we dive into the lives, challenges, and triumphs of women from all four corners of the globe. We're here to inspire, enlighten, and connect, sharing stories that uplift and empower. So grab a cup of coffee, settle in, and join us as we explore the incredible journeys of women shaping our future. This is Her Story, where every woman's voice matters. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Diversity Connector. This is Gertrude Mache here in beautiful Melbourne, Australia. And today I am graced with the presence of yet another fascinating woman. Welcome, welcome, welcome to the show. Please tell everybody your full name, where you're based, and share your diversity story with us today. We really want to know who you are.
Thank you so much for the invite. My name is Sile Walsh, despite the spelling. That's the Irish spelling for it. I'm based in Ireland, Dublin currently, but I'm from Cork, which is in the south of Ireland. And we have a little joke in Ireland that you have to say you're from Cork when you're from Cork. So when I think about my diversity journey and I think about my journey to inclusion, it goes right back to where I began. And that was being an Irish child in the UK. And then later coming back to Ireland, having had a history in the UK, having an English accent. And that was my first experience of what different might feel like for somebody. So in the UK, I wasn't English enough, I was Irish. And in Ireland, I wasn't Irish enough, I was more English. And this kind of continued throughout my journey where I noticed differences. I moved school several times and I noticed that who I was and how I was in the world was different to some of the contexts I was within. The way I saw the world, the way I engaged in education was different. As a dyslexic, which was only discovered later on when I was a teen, I realized that I'd been learning through a lens that didn't really support me in thriving or performing. And really, I spent most of my time struggling. And that was my very first introduction to the idea that we could all be sharing a space and have differences that were invisible. Obviously, I didn't get the language of difference and invisibility until I was an adult, but I knew this feeling of experiencing the world slightly differently to how other people were describing their experiences. I knew that in school, when I interacted with people, they had a lens that was usually informed by their geographical location, the experience that they had. And then later on, as I grew up, I started to interact with people from different parts of the world with different religious experiences, with different racial identities, with different experiences of society, not just in terms of identity and labels, but actually historic experiences of being marginalized or on the cusp of society in different ways. I got to meet a lot of activists. I got to meet a lot of people who were trying to change society for the best. And then as I went on, I started to see my own differences. I started to see how being presenting as a woman in the world changed things, how being Irish in different contexts changed things, how being someone who was in a particular family and from a particular part of the world and in a particular class setting informed things. And so later I went on to do different pieces of work around personal development and professional development, and somehow accidentally slid into inclusion work. I won't say diversity work because I don't think that's where I slid into. I more naturally fell into inclusion work. And what I mean by that is I ended up working with people of all sorts of identities and backgrounds and experiences to think about how we are more included in society and in the workplace. And that then formatted and led me to thinking about organizational inclusion and the identities of employees and people within the organization. And that has led me into, I'm in my third year of a PhD in inclusive leadership. It's led me to volunteer in society in different groups. It's led me to question some of the norms that we associate with leadership and professionalism and workplaces. And it's led me to understand how internalized we have racism and ableism, and how systems are designed for particular people without necessarily considering the differences and the diversities. I went on and I'm qualified in coaching psychology and I work in organizational development. And my supervisors work on the cusp of inclusion and anti-oppressive practice and thinking about differences rather than necessarily diversity. Because sometimes when we talk about diversity, what we're talking about is anyone outside of the label of norm, as if we centered one experience as normal. Whereas I like to think about diversity as something that we share. Every single person has differences. Some of those differences are aligned with their identity, their group experience, their backgrounds. Other parts of our identities are choices that we make, preferences that we have, ways we see the world, ways we process it. And so to me, diversity and inclusion work is actually about creating spaces in which people can feel included. So I've spent the last number of years working with organizations and leaders around creating inclusive environments where people can perform, where people can thrive at work, and where work isn't just a place where they have to move things forward. So that's kind of my background around it. On a personal level, I believe in co-creating a world where inclusion is something that's embedded into everything that we do, and that we consider differences and nuances and complexity whenever we're thinking about society or the workplace. And I do that because of my background, not just my own identities, but the identities and the experiences of people around me, the way that intersectionality plays into how we interact in the workplace, how we feel about ourselves, how we understand what good looks like. And I think a lot about and talk a lot about how some of the terms that we've classified, like imposter syndrome, is actually a reference to a particular experience, but is being spread across the workplace as if everyone who feels like they don't belong is experiencing imposter syndrome. I don't think that's true. I think what people are experiencing is that the workplace has subtle cues that says they're not for you. So if I tell you about why I've come to see inclusion in this way, I'd start by saying that I knew what being excluded felt like from multiple perspectives. I felt excluded in the UK, I felt excluded in Ireland. I felt that the educational system wasn't designed for me. And yet at the same time, I went and got a part-time job in a fantastic restaurant, one of Ireland's top restaurants. And I found that when I went to work in that environment and I was using my skills, it didn't matter how old I was or my gender, I was able to thrive. And that was one of my first experiences of how a context and an environment might be the issue with inclusion and with the experience of diversity in the workplace. That it might not actually be the person's identity, and it may not actually be the barriers that we talk about, but it might be that the environment hasn't been created for the people it's trying to engage. And within that profession, I thrived. I absolutely loved going to work, while I also went back into school each day and really hated it. So I left school at 15. I was an early school leaver because it just wasn't the environment for me. And I went on to think about how the work environments we're in can be places where people thrive. And I thought about, and I experienced moments where I was in denial of the barriers my gender was creating for me. I have multiple experiences where I was evidently paid less than others, and multiple experiences of sexual harassment that at the time I just normalized and said, I need to get on with this. I need to continue. But it took me a long time to know what that meant. It took me a good 10 years to understand that what was happening wasn't just acceptable or wasn't just something I had to get on with. I then went on and I work in multiple different settings now. But one of the things I found is that as somebody with a disability, with dyslexia, working class background, white woman in the world, I have many intersections of privilege and disadvantage. And I became really curious about why most of us, when we talk about inclusion, talk about being included. We talk about ourselves and we think about how can me or the people I love be more included. And I started to notice how different groups that were marginalized were competing for resources and competing to be heard and competing for platforms, as if there's a certain amount given to those of us who are marginalized to compete for, rather than to look across and say, how do we integrate this information, this identity, this knowledge across what we consider to be the norm, instead of just defaulting to some dominant norms that we've inherited. And so that's what led me to inclusion more so than diversity. I see diversity as something that every human being has, and with that diversity comes many different experiences of power and marginalizations and barriers and access, and that they are different for different groups. But I also see that the solution comes into us being included, and that in any environment that I was included, I was able to thrive. And this includes going to work when I was 15. It also includes my experience in third level education. It involves understanding how we have these subtle barriers to inclusion based on your identity or your background. And all of the assumptions that we have about professionalism and work ethic and all of these ideas that we have about what is good enough in the world. And because of the experience I'd had in education and my experience of moving from country to country in multiple schools, I also knew what it felt like to look like you belong while you feel like you don't belong. And so my research in inclusive leadership is looking at how leaders relate to inclusion and can foster and facilitate it in the workplace. But also the work that I do with organizations is linking that idea about what is inclusion. And there is a science piece. Shore et al. 2011 states it as the balance of belongingness and uniqueness. And when I think about it in that lens, inclusion doesn't require assimilation. Inclusion requires an adding of our differences and our values together, and then also the ability to create a shared belonging, but that belonging isn't based on identity or backgrounds. That belonging is based on our shared goal or task at hand, what we're trying to achieve together. And for me, that felt like the right place to be, mostly because I have multiple identities that are invisible and don't always impact me with barriers in an overt way, the way that some other people's visible identities do. But also because I knew about those subtleties of being on the cusp while you look like you belong. And so it just naturally brought me to thinking about inclusion and thinking about how we create more space for what is considered the norm, for it to be more diverse and richer. And that the only way we can do that is by creating safe places for that to occur, for differences of opinions to be leveraged rather than competed, where behaviors and communication is a value add, that we have a standard around those, but that we don't try to police somebody's beliefs or values, because in a way that's creating assimilation. And so I guess I naturally fell into this space because of those values and those lived experiences. And I intentionally work with leaders because at one point, half my work was community development based and the other half was private organizations. And I started to see how in communities, we often rely on the infrastructure around those communities to build those communities up. That includes opportunities for education, opportunities for jobs, opportunities for flourishing, for your children to be educated, that for people to thrive in their communities, we actually need a relationship with private industry. And that can be quite challenging to perceive that, because often we see them as indirect competition. And then I started to notice that the leaders I worked with in private industry thought that they were having a positive impact on the communities and didn't always hear directly from the communities or understand how their decision to put a load of money this year into one area and then withdraw it and put it into another area might be more harmful than not doing either. And so I started to see how leaders in private industry had the ability to inform their communities, not just by the leadership position that they had, but also because they lived in the communities usually or thereabouts, and they were also parents or colleagues or friends or family, and they had roots in the communities as well. And so I started to see that there was this compartmentalizing happening between people where they saw themselves in one role professionally and in another role in the community. And so I decided to focus on working with leaders, specifically because I was already doing it, but also because I could see that they had access to power and resources that they didn't always see the benefits of or know how to use. And I thought that if I worked with people who had these resources and had access to this power, who themselves weren't feeling empowered all the time, then actually maybe we could cause ripple effects, that the workplaces were communities where people thrived, but then also that those people went home and added to their communities because they were thriving at work. And so for me, there's this interconnection between all of us all the time, whether it's individually in our communities or in our workplaces. We're constantly moving. We can't really compartmentalize those. And so we need to think about inclusion and identity and diversity and belonging through the lens that we are often have multiple roles in multiple parts of society, in private industry and also in our communities, and that leaders and employees and people are not just one or the other. We're often many things. And how we do one thing often influences and impacts how we do another. And so thinking about how we are being ourselves and connecting is really helpful to thinking about how we want to be in the world. And I suppose for me, my personal and professional life are really entwined. There's nothing that I do with clients or organizations that I haven't reflected on, processed myself, engaged with in other organizations, because to me, there is no expert in this field. There's just people who are trying to be the best that they can be and trying to work with different people in different ways. And so I like to say that I specialize in inclusion, and that comes from my experience of both being excluded and included in society and in work.
Wow, you have had a fantastic background, Sheila. You know, when one looks at you, you look like the typical European woman who would never get to experience what it is to be excluded. For me, I show up with my chocolate brown skin, and immediately I don't fit in. I don't fit into any of the spaces and places I've lived for the last 56 years. So let's just go and talk about your exclusion experience. Where was that? How did you experience it? Because for a lot of people of color, we actually don't realize that this is happening to European women as well. We feel that you tend to blend in, you look like the rest. Share that experience with us a little bit.
And I think it's really important to say that when you have invisible barriers to inclusion, that is a privilege too, because like you've just said, there can be an assumption that you belong in the space without it being checked. And I do know that from a racial point of view, you know, that privilege isn't available to people of different ethnicities and races. So I don't want to pretend that they're in competition. I want to say actually that visible barriers create more overt discrimination that's easier sometimes to identify, not always to rectify, but to identify. In my experience of exclusion, I suppose, is quite diverse as well, in the sense that there are layers to it. So one is based on Irish history, being a person in Ireland with an English accent doesn't go well. And that resulted in multiple bullying in multiple schools, from psychological to physical assault. And that was interesting because at the time I didn't know anything about difference, and all I could see was I was rubbing people up the wrong way. I didn't quite know why it was, and it was by different bullies as well, which was really interesting. I think I moved schools 4 times before I was 12, and in all 4 settings there was something about me that didn't fit, and that was for multiple reasons. The way that I speak, where I'd been brought up, the different foods I was eating. I grew up in a very diverse area of London. Like, not grew up, my first number of years were in a very diverse area of London, which meant I was eating food that back home in Ireland nobody had even heard of. And so I was bringing very odd things to school for lunch, like really subtle things like that. But I think the bigger piece was not being diagnosed with dyslexia and being dyslexic in school, which was where I would in class engage really actively and be really questioning. And then in assignments or in tests, I would very rarely pass, or I'd get very low marks. And I was constantly getting the feedback I wasn't doing it right. And every time I adapted to do it better, there was still a consequence. So that was kind of the educational side of things. But also my family experience wasn't that everybody else had. I grew up in a home where there was mental ill health. I grew up in a home where there was a lot of intergenerational trauma presenting. And so how I saw the world and how I approached the world was different to other people. And I didn't really fully grasp that until secondary school or high school, as people in America would say. And I didn't grasp it because I had friends and colleagues and peers who were approaching the world in a particular way. They were worried about particular things, and I was worried about other things. I was worried that I was going to fail in school, so I took on a part-time job. I was worried I was going to be stuck where I lived. I was worried about family members' well-being, health. And so I just noticed I was slightly out of step a lot of the time with my peers. And then in terms of feeling excluded, it wasn't necessarily that this was done to me, but because I then went to work very young, I was in work environments that were for a different age group. And while I engaged in those work environments in one particular way, when I was out in society, I was being treated like the age that I was, or like people perceived me to be. And so it was very disjointed in that way. And then later on in my journey, there was lots of different challenges around identity. I also realized, I never even mentioned this, I'm a queer woman as well. So I didn't even know that queer women existed. I just knew you could be a lesbian, or you could be gay, or you could be straight. I didn't realize that you could have a diversity of attractions and relationship with gender. And so for me, it was always being reaffirmed to me that I was straight, regardless of how I was identifying or experiencing the world. And so it wasn't that people necessarily did inclusion to me, exclusion, the way we think about it. It was that the environments weren't designed necessarily to consider my experience. And so it wasn't that that there was a prejudice necessarily upfront, like following me around a store because of something, but it was that I was getting subtle cues all the time. This environment isn't for you. You don't belong. You're not good enough.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So that really brings us to the whole intersectionality lens that we have to view diversity. For me, living in New Zealand for 22 years, living in Australia, I've always have to explain who I am. I actually identify as being a Black Kiwi, a Black New Zealander, more than anything else. I've lived there for the longest part of my life. And in the whole time I lived there, I've always had to explain. People always ask, so where are you from? So where are you from? So where are you from? Then I moved to Melbourne 2 years ago. And the first assumption when people take a look at me is they think I'm a refugee. And if you're a refugee, you're not educated, you don't speak English. And I find people, talking down at me or not even talking to me at all. So intersectionality is absolutely imperative in understanding diversity, that an individual is a sum total of many, many, many parts. And you really are a cocktail of many of those parts. And just navigating in that world where there's different aspects of you that have to be brought together. How does that feel? Do you feel authentically yourself? Does the imposter syndrome come in? How do you express and explain yourself?
I think the feeling of authenticity is an interesting one. So one of the challenges I have is I am very authentic. I tend to be very aligned with myself. And when I'm not, I will think about that and work on that. But what can be challenging is often people will make assumptions about who I am, a bit like what you've described. And I then either have to choose to correct those assumptions, or I have to let them be wrong, or I have to create some space between me and that assumption, that I don't internalize it. So I think for me, that authenticity piece is something that I try to take care of within myself, what can be really hard because other people may not perceive me as authentic, because I also don't believe I should go around giving out labels to people to be treated in a fair way. So and that includes, I don't believe that I should have to explain myself to anyone. So if I choose to share something with someone, like having this conversation with you, then that's a choice I make. But I don't feel that I owe that to people. And sometimes that creates a disadvantage, and sometimes that creates an advantage, But how people feel about that is a really hard one. Because the assumptions that are about me are usually positive. So the assumption is I'm white, so I am white and I am privileged because of that. But the assumption is that I'm able-bodied, that I'm not neurodiverse, and that I'm straight. And so a lot of the assumptions give me power.
Yes.
and so they fit me into something. So it's a very odd experience of diversity in that sense, versus if I was physically disabled and visibly, the assumptions would be more negatively impacting me. So there is this, they call it passing privilege, that I have to navigate, where I try not to be inauthentic with people, but I also don't believe I owe anybody
An
like an
explanation.
invitation to my identity. Yeah. Because my identity is precious, as is yours. And yeah, and I think part of explaining our identities might be part of oppressive norms, that we have to explain ourselves in some way.
Yes, yes. Now, let's discuss a little bit about creating inclusive environments and what that looks like. You're working in different organizations, facilitating in this space. Take us through a step-by-step process of how any organization can create inclusive environments where their workers, their staff feel safe.
I love that question. So the first thing I would say is that it is better to attempt to do this before there's a problem. That's not the case most of the time. Usually there's a complaint when somebody approaches me and says, look, we need to correct something. But the best place to start is now, wherever that is, whether you're up to your eyeballs in problems or not, start now. The first thing that I would usually do is consult with current employees. And I talk to the organization about getting the voices of current employees and creating a safe way to do that. We can do it in focus groups, we can do it through private conversations, we can do it through forums. But what I have found is that when you first initiate this conversation, you don't really get the truth. You get a high level test of whether they can safely talk to you about the topic or not. That's the first point, is don't decide what your organization should do, talk to its employees, because before you go out to market and before you position yourself as inclusive, you need to check how your employees' needs are being met. And that can be done through, as I mentioned, loads of different types of dialogue. But that's the first point. Don't HR decide what needs to happen. Talk to your employees first and find out where exclusion or barriers to inclusion are occurring and start there. The next point is, after engaging with different people about different ideas, come together to think about what would have the biggest bang for your buck. So what has the best outcome for employees and what efforts need to be prioritized. And again, we never make these decisions for organizations, we make them with employees. So we start to get groups of people interacting and making decisions about what's best. The next part is, you need policies and procedures, but a lot of legislation is anti-discrimination. So it's about not discriminating. That is one side of the spectrum. The other side of the spectrum is inclusion. And that isn't the opposite to anti-discrimination. That is an active practice of inclusion. And so understanding where you fall on that spectrum will help the organization also decide what actions they might need to take to build a more inclusive organization, not just a non-discriminatory one. And then after that, you need to make sure that policies and procedures and structures have it. And this is the part that often gets missed if HR are leading on this, that the social structures are replicating what we need, what best practice looks like, what inclusion in team meetings, in hiring, in interacting at the water cooler look and feel like to people, and that we can talk about them and develop that capacity within the people within the organization and the organization as a whole. It's not just about formal structures, while they are important. If you don't take care of social structures, how power is shared, is sourced, who is listened to, how non-inclusion is interacted with, if you don't deal with the social exchange, you're not going to have an inclusive experience. But you might have policies and procedures that say we are inclusive, but you won't necessarily have the experience of being inclusive.
So let's conclude with your passion. You work with leaders. You are focused on inclusive leadership. How can one implement inclusive leadership within an organization?
So there's loads of things, because context is king. The first thing is, I have a pocket guide. It's a free gift of 5 research-driven strategies. So that might be a good place for people to start, because it is research-orientated. One of the first things I would say is, if you're trying to be more inclusive, listen more and ask better questions. Because sometimes what happens is we ask questions and don't listen to the real answer. We kind of push it into our frame of reference. And the other thing is, how are we using power? How you listen and how you use power are probably 2 of the biggest indicators to inclusive leaders, because how you're using power when you're being inclusive is attempting to ensure that people feel like they belong and they can bring their unique perspectives into the conversation. and you're willing to listen and be wrong. You're willing to evolve your position. So there are three things that are often associated with inclusive leaders: the ability to be humility, to engage in humility, the ability to engage in cognitive diversity, so cognitive complexity, apologies, which is the ability to think about multiple points of view, hold multiple truths at once, and then pro-diversity beliefs, the belief that difference adds value and is not a favor or a moral thing, but actually adds value to the task. And that's what we're learning from the research as well. So that's probably where I'd start.
Wow, this has been an interesting discussion, Sheila. Thank you so much for gracing us with your presence, with your knowledge today. The Diversity Connector is really looking for people like you who are in the field, who are doing the work, because like you said, the difference of opinions can be leveraged. When people come in with different lenses, your organization will thrive. Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody who's tuned in today. The Diversity Connector is here to shine a light on all aspects of diversity, inclusion, equity, and belonging. So tune in again tomorrow when I interview another interesting guest. In the meantime, have a fantastic day, morning, or evening, wherever you are in the world. And Sheila from Ireland, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Bye for now, everybody. Thank you for tuning into the Her Story Circle podcast. I hope today's story has inspired you to believe in the power of our stories and the difference you can make in the world when you use your voice. I'm Gertrude Mache, and it's been an honor to share this space with you, where voices from all walks of life come together to weave a rich tapestry of diverse perspectives. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review our podcast to help us share these stories with more listeners. Follow us on social media by looking for the Her Story Circle podcast for more updates. And join us tomorrow for another episode filled with courage, resilience, and empowerment. Remember, your story matters, and together we're building a stronger, more inclusive world. Until next time, keep making her story.